Welcome to Onboarding Students and Families. We are going to share out some of our sort of general thoughts about how we are looking at all of this sort of newness. There's a lot of new going on. There's a lot of transitions that are happening, that will be happening, that happened in the spring, that will be happening throughout the year. And we want to talk a little bit today about how you are using the first couple weeks of your school year to kind of prepare your parents and your students for those different transitions, because it's going to be kind of a tall order in terms of the amount of flexibility. So my name is Andrew Shaver. I'm an instruction and technology coach at Ingham ISD, and I'm also one of the co-directors of 517 Ed Tech and a classroom integration support for REMC 13.
And my name is Nicole Greider, and I'm an early childhood specialist and an early literacy consultant over at Ingham ISD. So I work a lot with our early childhood programs, birth through pre-K, as well as our elementary schools.
And I'm gonna warn you before we do our goals. This is a 2-hour presentation that we are going to try and fit into 1 hour. I think the information is really, really good, but there may be portions of this where you find yourself going, whoa, guys, slow down. And it's okay if you think that, because ordinarily we would be doing this in twice the amount of time. Okay, so just that gives you some insight as to why there may be portions of this where we're just kind of keeping the pace up. Okay, feel free, please use the chat at any given time. One of us is going to be presenting and one of us is going to be eyeballing the chat. So if you've got questions or you have clarifications, please type them in there and we'll make sure and do our best for you, okay? So our goals for today are these. We want to understand why implementing a strategy for onboarding is actually important, okay? We're going to make a case for that being fully necessary. The second thing is we want to discuss this idea of a unit zero, and we will define that term, but we want to talk about it in terms of its facilitating two different transitions. Transition from face-to-face instruction back to digital instruction that is remote, and then also the transition between teacher-directed in-school instruction and parent-supported or student-directed at-home learning. Okay, so we got two different transitions that we're going to try and talk about with this Unit Zero idea. We're going to define strategies for onboarding students and families for digital tools, as well as making sure that we're managing the barriers to accessing the instruction. And then we're going to define strategies for engaging students and families to become partners in their own learning, because that's ultimately what's at stake here.
So I've dropped in the chat a note-taking guide. If you're interested in using it, it will prompt you to make a copy for yourself. And there will be a few times when we'll be asking you to do some reflection about your own classroom. And then this tool is to help you think through those reflection periods.
Oh.
See, it prompts you to make a copy.
Look at that. All right. So let's talk about the why. Why are we here talking about this? Well, as we were aware of in the spring, I don't think I have to tell you that it was a little rough. And what the little rough was at times was our students not staying consistently engaged, largely because either we weren't fully prepared or they weren't fully prepared to take advantage of the digital tools that they had and to make good use of the instruction that we were providing them through those digital tools. Also, we were aware increasingly that our students and families were not prepared necessarily to have like 100% instruction and learning going on in their own home spaces. So when you combine these two things, we had tech tools that the students weren't fully comfortable with instructional models now that the teachers and the students weren't fully comfortable with, and learning in environments that weren't necessarily well prepared for this type of activity. You had a lot of students dropping out. You had a lot of students disengaged. You had a lot of work not getting done very well. And it was frustrating. So this is what we really learned. And I'm not trying to place blame on any entity, right? That's not the point. The point is we were not fully prepared as a system to help students manage the transition from mostly synchronous face-to-face instruction to potentially asynchronous digital instruction. And then also teacher-led in-school teaching and learning to parent-supported or student-directed at-home teaching and learning. Okay, those two back and forths, and I'm going to use my hands, right? I fill up my window here. Those two transitions are the ones that are going to get in the way, and preparing students for those transitions are going to make or break what we're doing here for the fall and into the winter and spring of this year. Now, lest we think that we are simply preparing for coronavirus, I think it would be dangerous for us to think to ourselves, well, we're going to do all this work to prepare for this coronavirus and it's just going to be gone in 2 years anyway, or whatever. Okay, now some people are making the argument that it may not be gone. I don't know anything about that. But I am saying that even if it does go away, all of these things that you see on the screen here are still true. Students still get sick and take long-term absences. Teachers still have to go on long-term leave. Support staff still haven't been trained properly to support people in small group settings. Like, all of these things are true. This coronavirus exposed issues. It didn't create them. So we want to try our best to create these setups so that ideally, and this is a lofty goal you're looking at here, but ideally, when we have to make those transitions between digital teaching and learning and face-to-face teaching and learning, there's no drop-off in quality, there's no drop-off in engagement, there's no drop-off in achievement, okay? That students are fully prepared to have to bounce back and forth between those two settings, so that even, 5 years from now, kid's got to get his wisdom teeth out and is laid up for 3 days, he still has a sense of what it's like to get in there and have to do some work in an asynchronous way because he's been prepared for that. Okay. Now, the idea is, too, we want to be clear about this, right? We're still learning how the best practices of this go. So we have to rely on best practices that we already knew, okay? And we do know some of these things. We know what it looks like to teach and learn well. We know what it looks like to engage our families and why we should do it. We know what it looks like to prevent dropouts and to keep students engaged, okay? We may not know fully how to do that in a remote setting with a pandemic going. We may not know that necessarily, but we can take a lot of what we do know and transfer it into these spaces. And I think that's what we're going to try and provide you with today. Okay, so far so good. Let's start with this idea of unit 0. Okay, so I want to define this term for you. Okay, unit 0 is a complete unit. Okay, and when we say units have things. Units have lessons. Units have direct instruction. Units have assessments. Units have opportunity for reflection and reteach. Okay, so it's a complete unit that is meant to ready your students and families for the rigors of learning in your class. Okay, now, based on what that means and the transitions that we've described, that's going to mean preparing them to have to engage digital spaces and to do some learning and teaching in their home environment. Okay, and we're going to talk about those things. Okay, so we're going to break those two transitions. We're going to break it into 2 parts. I'm going to handle the first part because I'm kind of like a speeding locomotive once I get talking. And then Nicole will cut me off, and then she'll go from there. Okay?
Perfect.
So part 1 is going to be talking about this idea of the digital tools. Okay? So I want to start with this statement, which is something I don't think is going to surprise a lot of us. Okay? Often, when we're using digital tools, when we increase the number of tools we use, we increase the number of barriers that exist for students. Okay? That, I think, is a true statement. Now, previously, oftentimes, we have used that fact as a means and a reason to avoid using too many tech tools. But we don't have that luxury anymore. So now we see those barriers. We have to identify them early. We have to strategize around them. We can't just avoid the tools. If Google Classroom is too tricky for our students, we may not have another choice. We might have to function through Google Classroom. And so the idea is to identify the barriers and get around them. And before the real learning starts. Okay, to get this stuff out of the way before you start asking them to learn content. Okay, so now I want you to head over to your note-taking guide real quick. And I want you to think about the digital tools that you're going to be using this year to engage your learners. And I know that some of you are going to see a lot of face-to-face students. Some of you aren't going to start by seeing any. Some of you are going to be somewhere in the middle. Some of you are expecting transitions mid-year. Like, all of this is true. So think about the digital tools that you're going to use. And when I say digital tools, I'm talking about anything you're using that is internet-based, okay? But it might be Zoom or Google Meet. It might be Google Classroom. It might be Reading Street or Khan Academy, Remind. Whatever you're using, Seesaw, ThinkCenter, it doesn't matter, Dojo. Whatever digital tools you're thinking of using, put them down on your note-taking guide or jot them on a piece of notebook paper or something nearby. Write them down. Like, I want you to see all of them. Here's the question. What do your students and families need to be able to have, know, and do in order to fully access those tools? And you have to remember that those tools are the vehicle the content comes through. So if they can't fully access the tools, they can't fully access your content. Okay? All right. Now, here's something that you're going to hear me and Nicole repeat a bunch today. Okay? When you add one thing, you're not just adding one thing. Okay? No one thing is one thing. Okay? Now that sounds a little confusing. Go with me here. Let's suppose we're going to add Google Classroom. And we talk about that like it's one thing. It's basically my same class. I'm just adding Google Classroom. But it's not just one thing. They've got to know their login. They got to have a tool. They got to have internet. They've got to be able to click around and type things and read what you've written and find the organization and manage a Google Drive a little bit. Like, there's a lot going on with that one thing. Same thing with homework. Oh, we're just going to ask them to do a little bit of homework. That's just one thing. It's not just one thing, though. There's some self-direction. There's some time management. There's some organization of resources. There's materials at home that are really useful. They've got to have a quiet space and some dedicated time to sit down and focus. Like, it's not just one thing. So when we consider a tech tool, we want to walk ourselves through these questions, okay? How are they going to access that tech tool? What are they going to have to do when they get to that tech tool? And what can you do to make sure they know how to do all of that before they need to do all of that? Okay? If they can't access Reading Street, then your first reading lesson is going to be a flop, right? So how are they going to access that tech tool? Okay? Are they going to go through a tool like Google Classroom? So we're going to route them to Google Classroom first, and then they're going to go out. Do they need to log in? Are they going to have a separate login, like maybe with Discovery Ed or something like that? Is going to have a separate login? Is there a separate URL that they have to type in or bookmark on their Chrome browser? Like, how are they going to get there? Second, what are they going to have to do when they get there? Are they going to have to type? Are they going to have to point? Are they going to have to click? Are they going to have to take pictures? How about talk or record video? Are they going to have to upload things? Are they going to have to interact with their Google Drive? Like, what are they going to have to do? And third, what are the things you can do to make sure they know how to do all that stuff before the stakes rise up? Okay? This is the point of Unit 0. This last bit is the point of Unit 0. That's what Unit 0 exists to do. Okay? So here's what we want to do. We call this stop and jot. We want you on your note, either your note-taking guide and maybe you type it, or on a piece of notebook paper or something. We want you to think about one of the tech tools that you wrote down. And maybe it's the one you use the most, or maybe it's the one you'll use first, or whatever. But think about that tech tool and write down some of the answers to these questions, some thoughts to how they're going to get there, what they're going to have to do once they get there, and then maybe we're going to talk after that about some ideas that you might have about what you can do to make sure they know how to do all that stuff before the stakes rise with content. Okay? So the question, this is the ultimate question, this is the point of Unit 0, is how are you building experiences to help students learn how to use the tools before they have to learn with the tools? Okay? So we have some examples of this. Now, I want to help build a case to help you understand just exactly what we're talking about, okay? Because oftentimes, especially early in the year, because of the relationship building, we want to help students be as successful as we can. We don't want them to come into our class and immediately struggle. Fair enough. And in so doing, we usually stick to things we know they can do well, okay? And that's perfectly understandable. The problem with it is, though, just like a piano player who needs both their hands to play a song well, if we only focus on the hand that we're good at, we don't spend any time strengthening the hand we're not so good at. And everybody seems to be stronger with one hand than the other, except for Nicole, who's a really good piano player from what I understand. So what we want to try to do is to create the type of experiences that will reveal to us which hands are the weak ones and how we can strengthen them. I used to say the same thing to my students. It's one of the ways that I got them to buy into doing their practice problems. Okay? If you don't do your practice problems, then I don't see you get that problem wrong until I have to grade it on a quiz. And then I see you get it wrong, and I got to mark you down. If you show me your wrong try on the practice problems, then I can help you fix it up so that when I grade it, you aren't getting it wrong. The same thing is true here. If a student doesn't know how to navigate Google Classroom, I got to know that. And I got to know that early so that I can teach that student how to use Google Classroom because they're capable. They just don't know how yet. And that's okay. So here's some examples of what we're talking about. So we're sticking with Seesaw and then some of the Google stuff. But like students sharing work with parents or communicating two-way with parents through Seesaw. These are ways that you can, you're doing this because obviously, yes, you want to establish good relationships. That's true. But you're also trying to figure out if you can connect with the parent. If a parent knows how to use Seesaw. If a student can upload things and share it, that kind of stuff. Same thing with Google Classroom or at home, right? Checking the weather or making a slideshow or filling out a Google form. Like we want to push them into some of these different areas strategically, not because we're super curious about whether or not they know what the weather is. I mean, we want them to know that, don't get me wrong, but we're less concerned about that and we're more concerned about whether or not they can click around a weather website. Okay, and then this gives you the ability to gather data, okay, which I know data turns into kind of a data, but like let's start thinking about, for example, an activity like this. Okay, so we're here on slide. What slide are we on? What slide is this?
27.
27. All right, so on slide 20, we have done 27 slides in 20 minutes. Told you we were flying, y'all.
Doing great.
So I want you to think about an activity like this. Now, I taught secondary. Nicole is got an early childhood background, so she'll give you some more examples that are for the younger grades. This is going to feel like a very older student activity. But like this, suppose this is my Google Classroom page, okay? And maybe this is the first activity. Is I have a video I want the students to watch, and then there's a form, okay? And I give them the instructions, and I say, if you have any questions, whoa, come back here, you. If you have any questions, send an email here or raise your hand. Maybe we're in a virtual session like this. And then you've got, maybe I set the assignment as, have this done by Sunday at 5. Okay? So let's suppose that I give this activity. Now what this activity is a video that we won't bother watching, but you could click on it and watch it.
I like it. It's a good video.
So amazing. You get to find out that my wife has rats and they live on her shoulder. There's a picture of her in there. But anyway, what's that?
Family pet.
Family pet, yeah. And but there's also this Google form. Now this Google form is to me sort of a little bit more important than the video. Although the video is important, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying with this though is like, look at these 4 questions. Okay. First, what is your name? Obviously that's an easy one. Second though, what's one thing Mr. Shaver shared that you also enjoy? Okay. Now, I'm trying to see if they can watch a video, listen to the video, and comprehend what's being said, and then do something with it. Okay? That's an important skill. Moving into 2020, COVID 2020, the ability to watch a video and actually listen and comprehend, that matters. So can they do that? Okay, second thing, what's one thing you enjoy that Mr. Shaver didn't mention? So now I'm getting an opportunity for them to tell something about themselves. And then what's your favorite food to eat for dinner? Just add a question. Okay, now, why would I have this due Sunday at 5? Well, now I'm starting to check executive functioning skills. Okay. Can the students manage a multi-step assignment? Can the students follow an instruction set? Can the students stay on task? Can the students manage their time for something that's not due? And I'll see when they submit the assignment. I'll see which early birds got in there and did it just as soon as it was assigned, which ones turned it in minutes before it was due, and which ones of them show up Monday morning without having it turned in. And the ones who didn't do it, why not? Is it because their internet was no good? Is it because they tried to do this on a phone and the video didn't play right? Is it because that they're not used to having to manage a long-term due date, and so they didn't do it and they forgot? All of those things are good things, but each of those, that's not what I meant. All of those things are good information to have, but there's a different solution for each one of them. And so to say to any given student just randomly, oh, you didn't do it, and so you must just be lazy, or you didn't do it, and so you must not be able to whatever. It's like, well, there's a little more to it than that. We want to know why students aren't able to complete this assignment. And let's be real about one thing. In the grand scheme of things, this assignment is functionally useless as the content goes. So if a kid can't do it and so doesn't learn that we have rats at home, they're not out anything. They haven't missed anything. But if we wait until the reading assignment starts or the first math assignment starts to find out that they can't do some of this stuff, now we're in reteach mode because they're missing essential content. Okay, so building an activity like this, which took me, you guys are starting to do screencasts and stuff like that. It took me all of 7, 8, 10 minutes to build that assignment. And I'm going to learn so much good information about my students and their habits and their skill set by doing it. It just seems like a total win. So this is an example of a Unit 0 assignment.
This is another example, the early childhood example, but just to reiterate what Andrew had said, this is like your right hand and your left hand, right? What you would already be doing probably face-to-face, as well as incorporating those digital tools and having them work together so you can get more information about your students. So you can do these assignments in the classroom if you're starting off the year face-to-face, and you can do them digitally if you're starting off the school year in a virtual setting. But with a lot of our young students who are using Seesaw, you could do the same thing though in Google Classroom or whatever learning management system you're using. Have them start off with a writing sample. So you need some baseline data on their writing anyways. You have a kindergartner, write your name, draw a picture of me. Or if they're a little bit older, tell me something you're great at. So this kid says, I'm great at art. That's great. But then also we want to know, can that child take a picture of their writing? Can they upload it into the learning management system and get it to you, right? The other piece to that, if you're using something like Seesaw, the family gets a notification when something's been added to their student journal. So maybe that's a second part of your assignment, and you're telling the family, you need to go in, check the journal, and heart or like the assignment so that I know that you saw it. So it's about the introductory activity, but it's also about assessing to see if your students and families can use the digital tools that you're asking them to use.
Here's another example, and it's along the same vein. Like we're trying to take a lot of these things we would already do, right? We'd already have icebreakers. We'd already have get to know your relationship building type stuff. Can we configure those in such a way that we can learn something from what it is that we're doing? And the home visit or the call home is another example. Like ordinarily we would choose either an email or a phone call because they've got the highest probability of success. And that, don't get me wrong, that totally makes sense under normal circumstances. But now we are going to need those students to be able to synchronously connect, and we need to know what that looks like. So I would encourage, rather than a phone call or an email, to set up a Google Meet with your parents at home so that you can get a look, not just, you can have the conversation, and that's a good thing too, but like, can you get a look at how well the connection is set up? How many of them are going to be setting up on a mobile? How many of them can you tell from watching their screen that they don't have a standard quiet place to do a Google Meet? Like, how many of them is the screen really pixelated and scrambly and locking up and freezing during the conversation? How many of them have to write you 5 or 6 emails to figure out how to get the link to work? Like, All of these things are really useful pieces of information so that you can then adjust and teach and do what you need to do. If half your class struggles with a Google Meet, then maybe you got to either find or make a video to send home to the parents so that they can figure out what to do with that link you sent them. This link here is a family technology checklist. And what this can do is this can help you guide that first Google Meet conversation and give you a template. Because I don't know if you've noticed, someone like me, like I have no problem making a phone call home because there's always something to talk about. But if I get engaged with the family and we get to talking, we may get way off task because that they may have gone someplace interesting for camping, or maybe they have something they're cooking and it's really interesting and I want to know what they're doing. You know what I'm saying? Like I get a little bit sidetracked. So
surprised.
Right. So having a script can be really valuable for me, or else I'm going to be on the phone with them 20 minutes and I'll never learn anything I need to learn, but I'll learn a lot. These are background surveys that, once again, these are just things that you can use to help students and help students reveal to you their habits, the parents, their readiness, these types of things where Unit 0 starts to really pay off, because we want to help people prepare for those rigors. And it's not just their preparation per se, it's us being knowledgeable about what they need. And through all of that, through that Unit 0, once you know what your class needs, then you got to put that stuff into play. Okay? If you find out, it's, once again, don't ask any questions you don't really want the answer to. Once you find out that your students are going to struggle with Google, half your class can't connect reliably to a Google Meet, you got to do something with that. You got to adjust. You either got to help them figure out how, or you got to pivot and use something else. Use a different tool. If you find out that Google Classroom is the tool you got to use, but that's presenting major barriers for a handful of your students, you got to deal with that. You got to figure out what you can do to support those kids.
This particular slide, these are all clickable links. So they'll give you some ideas of things that you could include in your Unit 0. We're not really going to recommend, like, this is Unit 0, everybody has to do it the same way. It's just what Andrew said. We have to know what your students need, and then you're going to develop your lessons for the first week or so of school around what your students in your classroom need. But these are resources you could use. So if you click on the first one for Google Classroom, for example, this is a sample slideshow on how to navigate Google Classroom, and it's intended for a secondary audience. But you can make a copy of this slideshow if you want to tailor it for your own self and put it up in your Google Classroom. It gives you an idea of what that could look like, and then you just insert your own information in there. RESA'a has a whole section on their website with ideas on how to set up Seesaw for your classroom. Michigan Virtual has an entire Unit 0 that's free. So there's, I think, about 9 lessons included in there. And if any of those are applicable to you, you could assign one of those for your students to do during your Unit 0 week. There's also Common Sense Media that has different videos on digital citizenship that are split up by grade level. So you could assign a video with some questions to answer. You could focus on covering expectations in PBIS. So this is a nice link to a virtual CHAMPS, thinking about how do you want your students to communicate? Should they be muted? Should they be unmuted? And then you could practice that during a large group meet or a small group meet. Similarly, virtual meeting etiquette. So things like wear appropriate clothing, make sure your background is appropriate, that kind of stuff. So you can click right on there, and that might be a lesson that you do in a small group or a large group. There's a nice, on the left here, sample first week of school stations. This is really intended for secondary, and it has a slideshow with different stations that you might have your students work through. They include things like how to use Flipgrid or agreeing to our digital citizenship rules in our classroom. And then there's also an example elementary schedule of how you might schedule your week to include these lessons. So we hope that you have time to look through that and click through that, and you find those resources useful for you.
One of the things, and then I'll shut up and let Nicole have her turn. One of the things that I found really interesting, because like I said, secondary teachers often get stuck in the should. Like we say things should happen. They should already know how to do this. Kids should already have that, right? You work with people who are used to working with younger students. There is no should. Like, they just don't have that part of them. Like kindergarten, day one at kindergarten, there's no should. The kids shouldn't even know how to line up. Like, they don't even know how to get off the bus. Like, there's no
That's
should
true.
at all. And so they get very, very used to things like, we're going to take this first Google Meet as a class, and we're just going to practice turning our camera on and then turning our camera off, muting ourselves, unmuting ourselves, raising our hand, like clicking it, typing something into the chat, and practicing what they'll say. Now's not a good time to type in the chat, guys. We're not going to chat now. Now we are. Like, it's that kind of stuff where if you just, like the secondary folks, just get yourself out of the mindset that they should be able to do anything and just investigate. And most of the times they'll reveal to you that they know, but you won't be guessing then. You'll know. You'll have seen it. You'll have evidence. And so, and then when they don't, you haven't taken anything for granted. You caught it early. You can go and patch it back up. And most of these kids you're prepared to teach them algebra 2. Then if they don't know how to navigate your Google Classroom, they'll be able to learn that super easy. That's way easier than algebra 2. So it's that kind of stuff. Okay.
All right, so on to part 2. So that whole first part was really thinking about the tools that you're using, and we had some space in the note-taking guide that you could maybe jot down, I could do an introductory activity, like the 3 that we gave you examples from, or if we did a welcome group meet, maybe what kinds of skills are you practicing? Are you doing your PBIS? But this part 2, if you go down, we're going to follow the same sort of structure as we did with part 1, because one part is the digital tools and the other part is the learning at home. So student independence, basically. So when we think about students who are learning at home, and this could be homework time, so if you're starting class in person, we're still thinking about what they're doing when they get home. We have to consider, how are they going to do it? It's the same. One thing is not just one thing. What will they need to do independently? Who's going to support them if they need support? And what are we going to make sure that they know how to do all those things before they have to do those things to learn content? So we're going to give them some practice with these skills before they have to learn the content that you want to teach them. So same thing, how are they going to do it? Will they need a desk or a quiet environment away from interruptions? Will they need additional tools? How much time will it take them? And what part of the day should they be working? So we can't assume that our students already have a spot set in their house, or they have materials on the ready, or they know how to manage their time. Thinking about what are we going to be asking them to do independently. So for example, we see a lot of teachers who say, I'm going to use a choice board. This is great. Kids have choice. They're going to be able to decide which activity they want to do or what order they want to do them in. But have they ever had any practice doing that? Have they had any practice setting goals and accomplishing their plan for the day? So thinking about what are they going to have to be able to do independently. And then depending on the needs of your students, will they need support? So will they need assistance logging in and understanding their assignments or monitoring completion and accuracy of their work? Will they need someone with them all the time doing this at home? Will the teacher be able to check in periodically to support them? Who is going to do that? And this last one, we'll get into some ideas of what we can do to make sure they have practice doing those things before they need to be able to do those things to access content. So here's our next little stop and jot for part 2 if you're using the note-taking guide, or if you just have a piece of paper, thinking about for a second, what kinds of things are your students going to have to do when they're at home? What skills might they need? What skills might their parents need? So it's not just do your homework at home, but let's break that down into our different considerations, having a learning space, accessing materials, things like that. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about some of the things your students are going to need to do to manage themselves when they're learning at home. Okay, let's move on, and we'll talk about how we're going to build experiences to help our families and our students become engaged in learning at home before they have to become engaged in learning at home. First thing though, what we know about engaging families and what research tells us, some educators believe that our families have very little to offer. So maybe these educators might say, these families don't talk to their child, or these families have no background knowledge to share with that child. But we really want to get out of that mindset So this doesn't really support our students' social, emotional, or cognitive development when we're thinking about that. We have to take the position that families have strengths. We're taking a strengths-based approach. Every family has some strength, and we can build upon that and extend upon that in our school. So that's our first and most important job as educators. Even with high school students, we know that families care about their students. So how can we build on those strengths when we're thinking about engaging families and students in their own learning? This next slide has a link to an engagement model that's been developed by Johns Hopkins University. It's called TIPS, Teachers Involve Parents in Schoolwork. And this is a research-designed program where teachers basically help enable all families to stay informed and involved in their students' learning activities at home. So this should help students complete their homework assignments. It should promote greater school success, and the whole premise behind that is that even though homework is the student's responsibility, the teacher is facilitating positive interactions with a family member or partner. So it helps families become involved, not just the few parents who are comfortable with school subjects. It doesn't necessarily teach subjects or skills to parents, but instead it gives them prompts, things that they can ask their student or child about at home, or things the student has to go home and talk to their family about. So it might have the students share their work or share their progress with their families. It might give families tips. For example, when you're reading a book, this is how I want you to prompt your child when they come to a difficult word. So the reason why I'm sharing this is just that you have an idea that we want to think about research with family engagement and think about ways that we can help embed the families and what the students are doing. The next part is just supporting families and putting it all together. So back to some of these lessons, we're going to go through some ideas for lessons, and you might provide these lessons to families in the idea of one of your Unit 0 lessons, so the families are involved in the example of the seesaw lesson, or perhaps your virtual home visits if you're doing that with families, scheduling a Google Meet to get families involved. Some schools are doing virtual parent orientations or virtual parent universities to help teach families and work with families with some of these things. Planning tasks. Those are the first types of tasks you might want to create lessons around to help your students. Here's an example. If you go back one, this is an example we have linked on here. So we know that even in kindergarten, we can help support those planning functions. You might send this home if you have students in person. That's Leanna. That's my daughter's name.
Sorry,
but say she has.
I was trying to click on those. I thought those were.
He's like, speed it up.
I know. I'm not buzzing you through. I promise. I thought those were clickable.
I'm not done. I'm not done.
So that's my bad. Sorry.
That's okay. I just screenshotted them in there, but there is a clickable link at the end. So for example, if she has library or she has PE, even as a 5-year-old, she can practice planning what materials she needs to prepare for her special. And then as students get older, sending home things like that, a checklist where they can think about, if I have a spelling test on Friday, what should I be doing each day of the week to prepare for that? Another example, families might not have a calendar system or a system set up in their house to organize their students' learning. So if you're doing any virtual learning, you may have to provide them with something like this table that's blank and laminated. They can write in their children's names and write down what time their meetings are going to be during the day, so that you can help the families get those things organized so that our students are on time and will be present. Another lesson you could do is just helping students plan out what they're doing that day. So this is an early childhood example. You might put a planning mat like this up into Seesaw where they have to think and then make a choice about what activity they're going to do first and talk about it. So all the child has to do then is tap the microphone and tell their plan about the day. What center will you do first? What will you do at that center? And what materials might you need to get your job done? And that's it. So just helping that child plan might be a lesson that you want to do at the beginning of the school year. This is just another example of planning. So for an older student, like upper elementary or going into middle school, maybe you have must-do activities and may-do activities. The student has to sit down and think about what materials they need to complete these activities and how much time it might take them. So that might be your lesson. Like before you get started today, I want you to write down what materials you're going to need and how much time you plan to do on each of these things and then send it back to me. So you're practicing that planning before you move out into the school year and have them completing all their assignments on their own. And even as students get older, just helping to facilitate this plan, do, review process. We see this process used even in businesses and companies when they're doing large project planning, having students practice, starting with the concept of what does done look like. So we have this assignment to do. What is it going to look like when it's done? And then do it. So what steps am I going to need to take to do this assignment? If you're writing a big research paper, they're going to have to find sources, like 5 or more sources. I mean, what are the requirements, right? They're going to have to draft an outline. Are they going to have a draft, revise, final copy, that kind of thing? Get ready. What materials do they need? How much time is it going to take them? And then when they're ready to get started, they need to gather the materials, find the quiet spot, they need to do the steps, and then the last piece is that done. So reflecting, does it look how I intended it to look? That double checking piece. So an example of this is you may plan a lesson at the beginning of the year and walk them through the steps. So here we're looking at animal and plant cells. This is what they look like, and you're doing a project on this. You're going to have to identify the parts of the cell, label them, and then color it all in, right? So what kinds of things are they going to need, and then when are they going to have to turn it in? So you might walk them through that process in some of your early lessons in Unit 0 so that you know that they'll be able to do that on their own later when you have an assignment for them. Planning even in high school. Google Classroom integrates Google Calendar. So this is an example. If you have students using Google Classroom, so maybe this is your assignment. Okay, I want you to download the Google Calendar app on whatever device you're going to use. I want you to check your assignments. I want you to set yourself a reminder to study. Okay, so that's just your lesson on helping them learn about planning and time management. And then this slide is here for you with all the links to all those different resources that we shared with you. So you'll be able to go through and link and have access to some of those slides and templates that you can copy and use for yourself. The next part of Unit 0 that we really want to practice is organizing materials. So thinking if you want to have any of your lessons be you're going to go home and set up a learning space, or you're going to go home and make sure you have materials to learn. We've talked with a lot of teachers who are having virtual classrooms about setting up at-home toolkits for their students. So thinking about what kind of material students might need at home. Do they need a container to keep it in, like a bag or a box? What might you put in there so that they have access to it? Are there things in your classroom that you want your students to be able to access when they're at home, like manipulatives, letter tiles, chips, Unifix cubes, things like that? A lot of teachers use whiteboards or response cards in their classroom, so maybe instead of sending home a whiteboard, we just send home a laminated piece of paper or a paper inside of a sleeve with a dry erase marker, because you can use those things during your class. So maybe the lesson is about getting your material kit, finding a place that you're going to store it, practicing accessing the materials that you're going to need during your lessons. And then technology tips. So this kind of goes back to not just using Google Classroom or using Seesaw, but how are we even caring for our technology, and how are we managing that when we have multiple students sharing a device in a household? So this might be something you work with families. Again, practicing using the features that you want them to use. Talking to families about downloading the necessary apps they need. So if they're using an iPad and you're using Google Classroom, then they need to download the Google Classroom app, and probably Slides, and probably Docs, and probably Google Meet. Do they have all the apps that they need on their device? You want to help talk them through that. There's an example of a password key ring on there for younger students, so they have something in hand to help them log in, or if you're using Seesaw, an actual picture of the QR code so they can just hold it up to the camera and practice logging in. And then other tips. So once you get to know your families, if you have a family with 3 elementary school kids at home, like I do, which is crazy, maybe you're going to help them create individual Chrome browsers for each child, and maybe those browsers have their specific websites bookmarked for them. Or create desktop shortcuts so that even a young child can open up their Chromebook and click on the shortcut to access the website that they need to access. So just thinking about tips to try to help make it easier on families to manage these things. This slide for you has links to different parent and family guides that are printable, or you could put them up in your learning management system, or you could email them to families. So they give step-by-step walkthrough on how to use Seesaw or Google Classroom, virtual meeting guidance for families, or Parents Guide to Google Meet. So hopefully those are useful for you when you're thinking about supporting families and putting this all together. And then the last piece to your Unit 0 is spending some time identifying an educational advocate. So what that might look like in the secondary world is identifying a mentor to support secondary students. So in many of our districts in the secondary world, there is a homeroom or some kind of structure like homeroom, like Win Time or something like that. And those teachers are accountable for those 25 to 30 students in their class. So you wouldn't be accountable to mentor all 150 students you see all day long. But as your homeroom class, you check in with those students on the biweekly basis. You just check in to see how they're doing, social, emotional needs, check in on their progress. If a student says, if you say, look, it looks like your science grade is not going great, maybe we should contact your science teacher and ask for some extra help. So we can't just assume that just because they're 15 years old, they know how to ask for help when they need it. So thinking about how we can offer that support to secondary students, and that's really going to help prepare them too when they're going off to college. And we know there's a lot of research that supports mentors when it comes to dropout prevention. So thinking about having extra contacts with those students who are at risk. For our elementary students, we want to help families identify an educational advocate in their home. So if the parents are working and they're not going to be there to help their child log on or access their schoolwork, who could help? Can we help identify a neighbor, another family member like grandma, or even an older sibling to help that student? So sometimes families just need help thinking about identifying who is available to support their child. So this is another important piece when we're thinking about our Unit 0, helping people identify, like, who can I go to if I need help? We are doing so great on time, Andrew. I'm really proud of us. This last slide is just sort of a flow chart for putting it all together. So we had a lot of information for you, but we want to help you think about this. At the beginning, we talked about surveying all families and students, something you're going to do to gather that data at the beginning so that you know what your families and students need. Of course, first thing is supporting connectivity and devices. So if we are not even able to access our devices, we need to remedy that first. Then knowing whatever your district's using for devices, think about what digital tools you are using that are and how they work on those devices. So if they're Chromebooks or iPads or whatever they're using, how are your tools working on that? Consider your synchronous and asynchronous. What are students going to need to be able to do asynchronous on their own, and what are they going to be able to need to be able to do when they're meeting live with you? And once you have all that information, you can start designing your introductory activities and your Unit 0 activities. You're going to be designing lessons to practice both that learning at home piece, that independence piece, and the learning with technology. And all that together is going to make up your Unit 0. Okay, so that was a lot of information. We were very speedy. But we do have this participant folder, and you do have access to the slides so that you can go back and click through and spend some time looking at things. And you're welcome to use any of the resources we have available.
There was a couple of things that were going through my mind while Nicole was talking, and I mean, obviously she and I have given this presentation now 5 or 6 times, and so, but every time I kind of get new thoughts because of how holistic like this is. Like this isn't like regimented and structured. This isn't a system you put in place. This is like, you got to know your system. You got to know your audience, you got to make sure they work together. And you're sort of in the role of identifying where the system and the audience are going to be mismatched and smoothing that out. And so there were a couple things that like, as Nicole was talking, I was thinking like be good friends with your IT team. Like, know kind of how to be a liaison between your IT team and your families. Know how to use the tools that you're working with from a tech standpoint. Like, I know that there are a lot of people, like a lot of teachers, that kind of get frustrated with having to do tech support because it's not easy to do. And it often isn't part of their skill set, and they're not a lot of practice doing it. But if you are able to help people kind of head off some of the frequent issues, like, oh, I'm not getting access to this Google Doc, can you help me? You know, not having to route that person out, like paying attention to some of the common hiccups that are going to happen and being able to head some of those off yourself as the sort of level one tech support person for your families is really useful. You know, having a good sense of the purpose of each of the different pieces in your class, knowing not just, we don't just do synchronous lessons because sometimes you got to do synchronous lessons. My principal told me to do synchronous lessons. Like, what is the goal of the synchronous lesson as in your system? What's the goal of the asynchronous lesson? And that kind of stuff. So it's those kinds of things that are, it feels very like rich in the sense that you got to know your system and know your audience and kind of position yourself between them so that you're always kind of like keeping one ear in both directions so that you can help make those connections.
And it doesn't have to be perfect because we're all learning. So, you know, just like even our presentation today, we have things that don't go perfectly all the time, and that's okay if it doesn't go perfectly for you either. Even if you just start with one tool that you want to practice and get really good at, and then help your students and families get really good at, that's okay. You can just start with one thing. It all doesn't need to be put together right now.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I mean, Nicole even still is trying to find a better co-presenter, someone who doesn't randomly click through slides or click off.
No, I think I'm stuck with you, Andrew.
While his screen is being broadcast to everybody. I mean, no big deal.
It's fine.
I have seen this about 4 or 5 comments now that have said things like, man, I wish I would have heard all this in the spring. You know, and to some degree, I mean, Nicole and I were giving this presentation in the summertime, but some of this, we had to go through the spring to learn, to kind of conceptualize this stuff, you know? And so some of that is, yes, as much as I wish too that we would have had this in the spring, sometimes it's like, you got to kind of go through the first stage of just kind of figuring it out before you're ready to figure out what you need to tell people or what you wish you would have known. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of that weird cycle. So I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. I think I said this, I do have like 3 young children at home. And so some of that is even me learning as a parent, like, oh man, this would have been helpful.